Hi, everybody. Appreciate you making some time to be with us today. What I wanted to do is take you through a couple of things related to some of the topics that Lacey was mentioning with a little bit of context here, just to kind of give you some background. So as you might know, last 4 years or so, in addition to my role as executive in residence for the center, I've been running my own coaching and consulting business, a portion of which deals with a lot of coaching and leadership development work. And within that coaching and leadership development work, as you might imagine, I'm spending a fair amount of time with HR leaders as well as non-HR leaders. But the HR leaders that I'm working with could be relatively new chief HR officers or people who've been identified as high potentials to maybe assume the CHRO role at some point, or other high potential HR leaders who are simply working their way through their careers. And what I'm finding through all of this work is some common themes around development, some common themes around areas of emphasis that people are trying to get better and more comfortable with, some common themes around some gaps and ongoing development needs that people haven't quite mastered yet, all affected to one degree or another by some future themes and trends that we're seeing out there in terms of the changing nature of work, the changing nature of the workforce, the changing nature of the workplace, and what implications all of that might have for the future of HR. As what we'll do as we go through the talk today is touch on elements of each of those things. It's also a little bit of a sneak preview of the program that Lacey mentioned a moment ago regarding some of the upcoming workshops happening at CEO. I'll be leading a program called the HR Emerging Executive on September 9th through the 11th in the LA area, where we'll spend about 3 days going through much more in depth some of the things that we'll be touching upon today. So if it turns out that anything I have to say is of interest or value, just want to let you know there's an opportunity for us to maybe spend a little bit more time together in September going through that more in depth if it's valuable to you. So what I'd like to do now is to kind of start taking you through a little bit of what I see happening out there in the world of HR folks and some of the things that they're wrestling with. I'm going to ask Carrie to help me out a little bit here. We're having a bit of a technical problem on my end with my computer, so I'm going to be speaking to you. She's going to be moving the slides along for us, and she's also going to be helping with notifying me if and when there are some questions that pop up in a couple of methods that Lacey referred to a few minutes ago. And I'll be taking some pauses as we work our way through all this to make sure that you have an opportunity to make some comments or ask some questions. The first thing I wanted to do was talk about HR leader development checklist. And what you might notice from looking at this page is I would describe it as the poor person's short version of all of the HR competency models and competency model work that's been done for the HR profession over the course of the last 25 or 30 years, all attempted to be boiled down to one simple page. Most of the people that I work with, no matter what level of the organization they're dealing with, to one degree or another, are spending time worrying about things such as, how do I better integrate business strategy with human capital strategy and demonstrate that the things I'm doing from an HR point of view are actually connected to the business in some way. People are also putting a lot of energy, particularly these days, the last 3 to 5 years, this has become an increasingly big deal, around leadership and talent development space. Part of that is driven by demographics and the shortage of leaders. Some of that is driven by a different set of demographics, which is A lot of senior level experienced leaders are expected to retire, eligible to retire over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. And who are we going to be replacing them with? And of course, in general, just the talent shortage that we're finding with regard to leadership development. So there's a lot of work happening in that area. A third area that people are putting a lot of their time and energy into is learning how to be better leaders of change, and all of the issues that you have to deal with when you're trying to take an organization from a current state to a future state without throwing the baby out with the bathwater and the things that have made your organization successful in getting there. One of the elusive, more difficult to define areas of focus that most HR people I'm working with are spending time trying to get better at is around the advice and partnership piece. You know, people often talk about this in terms of the perhaps overused terminology of HR business partner. And while it might be overused terminology, I think it's a fairly simplistic shorthand way of attempting to describe how do you demonstrate that you're business savvy and business knowledgeable while at the same time being able to offer practical advice and counsel to peers, to senior leaders you support, to your boss, if you're a CHRO, perhaps to the CEO and to the board of directors. Skill that's hard to measure but immeasurable in terms of its impact on an HR person's credibility. A lot of HR people these days are worrying about driving performance, and this takes a variety of different dimensions, ranging all the way from how do we take cost and headcount out, which is probably the least fun aspect of that, all the way to how do we build and drive a culture of innovation, a culture of performance, a culture of accountability, and it leads us down the path to talking about some things which have become very hot and popular to talk about and criticize, performance management being a great example of that. Depending on the level that an HR person might be at in their career, increasingly you're seeing HR people being affected and the way they're spending their time being affected by dealing with things related to what the board of directors cares about. If you're a CHRO, you spend an increasing amount of time up and out of your own organization. In many cases, that means spending more time supporting and working with the board, particularly around executive compensation issues, talent management, succession issues, and organizational culture and change issues that boards are increasingly interested in. But even at more junior levels of the organization, there's a flow-through effect. So if any of you who are on the webinar are finding yourselves, even though not directly interacting with board members, are finding yourselves being asked a lot more questions about talent, a lot more questions about leadership development, a lot more questions about succession, a lot more questions about executive compensation issues to the extent you are involved in those at all, a lot more questions about things like employee engagement, and certainly a lot more questions about data, metrics, analytics, and how do we know that we're actually making progress on any of the things that we're being asked to address. Many of those questions are actually a flow-through from things that board members want to know more about that, 10 or 20 years ago, they very rarely would ask about or pay attention to. And then the last couple of items I'll mention on this list are really more about understanding better what we need to do inside of HR to improve our own capability, to improve the talent within the HR function, and to better understand what the future trends and themes and issues are that we've got to get our arms around to anticipate over the next 5 to 10 years and beyond if we're going to remain relevant. I mention all of these things to you today not because this list is the only list of things. There are many other things that HR people are asked to deal with on a daily basis, and you know that because you're living it. I simply say that in my experience, when you working across different companies, different industries, different levels of experience within the HR profession, these are the things that tend to pop up most. You should feel free to use this if you're coming from a company that doesn't have the time or the resources to put a lot of money into the bigger, broader, more complicated HR competency models out there. I've had a lot of clients, for example, that have used this as a simple checklist if they want to do an assessment within their own organization, their own HR team. What are the strengths of their team members on each of these areas of emphasis? Where are people pretty solid but have more to learn? And then what are the big developmental gaps as a way of helping to prioritize how they're going to invest in people's development. This is a little bit of a foundational piece that leads me to take you to the next chart on HR leader development, the one that's got the triangle on it. And what I wanted to share with you there is the following perspective. Most of the HR people that I'm dealing with, in one way or another, are spending time focusing on three buckets of things. Focusing on what they need to know how to do, the content, if you will, of being an effective HR person, the who they need to be spending time with, and recognizing, of course, that changes somewhat as they shift roles, as they continue to move up the organizational ladder, as they become more senior in the organization. And then finally, what I call when, which is when are you going through critical inflection points in your own development? And given how busy you are on a day-to-day basis dealing with all of the typical headaches that you have to deal with, are you stopping just long enough, pausing just long enough to be able to say, this experience that I'm going through right now in this moment is unbelievably developmental. It's teaching me something. Am I making the time to step back and reflect on what it is I'm learning as I'm going through it? And how do I categorize that in such a way that I can come back and draw on the lessons learned from the experience when the time is right as I move into other bigger jobs where that experience base is going to be extraordinarily important to me. And part of why I emphasize this with lots of HR audiences and clients that I work with is because if you really stop and think about it, the vast majority of development work and development time that most organizations invest in bringing their HR people along tends to be more around content. We're going to send you to a leadership development program, or we're going to send you to a specific workshop that helps you get smarter about a specific area of HR, the content. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with making those kinds of investments. But what I'm finding is that it's out of balance. Almost all of the emphasis is on content. Very little of the emphasis tends to be on how do I help people as a senior HR leader figure out who they should be spending their time with. How do I help them build credibility with those key constituents? And also the growing recognition that even for mid-career HR people, the very best are spending more and more of their time working up and outside of the organization, where they're having to get better at, more experienced at the local, state, federal level, for example, understanding the impact of public policy on HR practices, and also understanding what are best practices that exist at other companies against which they compete for talent, which may or may not be in their own industry. But I will tell you that from a lot of my coaching work and a lot of my leadership development work, one of the most common gaps I find with people at every level I work with is they know a lot about their own company. They know a little bit more about maybe their own industry and what some other companies in their industry are doing. They know very little, frankly, about what's happening in terms of good HR practice across a broader spectrum of companies and industries, and they find that that lack of perspective really gets in the way as they get promoted and move to more senior level jobs, particularly the chief HR officer job, where the executives they're working with, the board of directors and others are asking them the question, well, how does your company's practices compare to what's great practice out there elsewhere? And many people are finding that they don't know the answer because they've spent 20 years of their career focusing exclusively down and in. And that's become an even more difficult situation lately because people are so busy, they don't have time oftentimes to lift their head up and look outside around them. And then finally, I'll make the point, and I'm going to stop and see if there are any questions. I'll make the point that from a win standpoint, the critical inflection points for development that I was talking about a few minutes ago, I'm not going to spend time going through each item on the list, but suffice it to say, when you look at your own career, asking yourself the question, have I had a broad enough foundation of experience across businesses that were in trouble and helping to get them to be better performers, businesses that were going great where we really had to grow it and sustain success, situations that were more of a startup scenario, more entrepreneurial, not necessarily in a small company, but even in a large company that you might work for, creating a business from scratch or a new business unit from scratch or a new function from scratch and not having the guideposts necessarily to follow. And perhaps the one that's most commonly talked about by people I work with is new boss, which, virtually, if we were in a room together face to face and I asked you all the question, how many of you have a new boss in the last 3 years or less, chances are there's a very large percentage of you that would say that you do because there's so much change in organizations. And most of us who've gone through the experience of trying to adapt to a new boss, would be able to say sometimes it's painful, sometimes it's incredibly developmental, but in any case, it's incredibly stretching in terms of having to learn new things, do things differently, answer questions in a different way than the previous person you'd be working for. So my message here is basically to say, when you're thinking about your own development and the development of people who work for you, a couple of things I want to emphasize that I'd like to see done better by organizations than they have been the last, last few years. One is making sure that you understand what the key capabilities are that are required. What is it that HR people need to know and be good at in order to be effective going forward, and the list that I'm sharing here is a focused example of those things. But also paying attention to the balance between content knowledge versus who you need to be spending your time with, and when you're going through these critical developmental inflection points, to be able to pay enough attention to it to actually get the personal benefit from learning from the experience. So with those points made for a moment, let me just stop there, take a pause, ask Carrie if we've seen any questions pop up, or if anybody hasn't raised their hand virtually yet. Now's an opportunity to do that.
Yeah, Ian, so we have one question from Diane Reese, and it is, would you comment on the impact/availability of talent analytics in shaping the success to the role?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure, Diane. Thanks for the question. Well, first of all, this whole area of analytics within HR has been a fascinating phenomenon to watch and be part of. Why do I say that? Because you're really talking about shifting people's capability as HR people from relationship-oriented persuasion to data-oriented education in order to help drive changes in how people make decisions. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this when we get into the Future of HR section of this webinar in a few minutes. But there are a lot of HR people who struggle with this. You know, they haven't been brought up to be they haven't been brought up to even focus on selling their story through analytics. Mostly they've succeeded as a result of being very successful at building credible, trust-based relationships, and because they have trusting relationships, people tend to believe what they say. That's becoming less workable as a solution, not because they don't have credibility or trust-based relationships, but because organizations are so stretched for resources and so limited for time. Everybody that you're trying to persuade generally has hard decisions to make, limited time to make those decisions, competing priorities that are also seeking out funding and resources to get stuff done. And so what people are looking for is much more of a prove it to me that this investment of time or money is going to be worth doing, and there's actually going to be a payback at the end that's somehow measurable. So I don't want to over-rely on analytics as the answer to all credibility that HR people have going forward. But I will say that to the extent that you have an ability to learn more about how to tell a persuasive story through data, and you have access to resources to help you with that, or to surround yourself with people who are good at it if you don't happen to be as good at it, that's a real strategy for success that I see a number of HR leaders using. The people who are tending to be left behind a bit are the ones who are continuing to over-rely on relationships exclusively to persuade people to do things that they might not want to do. Any other questions so far, Carrie?
That is the only one so far.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll certainly take a few more pauses as we work our way through this for any other questions or comments that come up. Let me continue on then with the foundation of what is it that I'm seeing HR people needing to spend their time on and get good at in order to be viewed as viable contributors going forward. One of the other things that I'm also finding is that there's a real connection between the HR person's role in developing and supporting other leaders relative to what does the HR leader stand for themselves as a leader. So I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about personal leadership philosophy, which is on the next chart, both my own and what I'm also seeing other leaders do. So here's a little bit of a way of thinking about this that I've discovered over the course of the last few years. Not surprisingly, like in so many other areas, HR people tend to be the shoemaker's children and don't really pay nearly as much attention to their own development as they do to the development of others around them. I think we've probably known that for years. One specific twist on this is that a lot of HR people I work with haven't really sat down and thought much about what do they want to be known for as a leader, what do they stand for as a leader, what impact does that leadership brand that they bring to the equation every day have on their own credibility, but also on their ability to help lead and teach other leaders to be better leaders. So there's a little bit of self-reflection involved here. And as I've talked with lots of HR folks about this over the course of the last 4 years, one of the things that often comes up is, well, hey, that's great, Ian, that's helpful to think about, but what's your personal leadership philosophy, and give me an example, of what something like this would look like if it were operationalized. So what I end up doing is sharing with people my own view on leadership as it relates to my personal leadership philosophy, and I share it with you here with one caveat, which is that my personal leadership philosophy should not be your personal leadership philosophy. If there's anything you can steal from it, great, and I'll take a minute and talk about each thing and what it means to me. But my message here is have a personal leadership philosophy, and don't keep it a secret. It's something that you ought to be using with people who work with and for you so they know what you stand for as a leader. But even if you choose not to go that route, not be quite so public about it, at minimum, to spend some time on your own thinking about, how do you want to be known as a leader, what do you stand for as a leader, and how does that drive or influence the way you interact with other leaders in the organization. For me, over the course of the last, 20 to 25 years, what's really evolved in my thinking is what I ended up calling the 4 C's around credibility, collaboration, courage, and competence. And for me, credibility is really all about, doing what you say you will do, and do you have the ability to keep confidential information confidential, which turns out for HR people in particular is non-trivial, because I've worked with a lot of HR people who are very technically savvy and competent in terms of content knowledge, but somehow or another ended up developing the reputation that they couldn't be trusted with sensitive information. And once people stop coming to you to tell you things that they don't want shared with other people for fear that it won't be kept confidential, it becomes extremely difficult to do your job and be effective as an HR leader. And I've seen more than a handful of people fall off a cliff as HR people for that reason, not because they weren't technically smart. In terms of collaboration, pretty simple way of thinking about it for me, which is around sharing things of value, like information, like resources, like talented people, in a collaborative way across the organization, particularly when it isn't very convenient for someone to do that. That's how I would like to be known as a leader. And whether or not I am, I guess we'll leave to other people's judgment in terms of how they've worked with me. But that's something that I've always articulated as being important to me. Another one for me that's important is around courage, which is trying to be known as somebody who's willing to push forward on the things that I think make sense and that are good for the organization, and push back on the things that don't make sense and are not so good for the organization, and the willingness to take a stand and do it publicly and fight for the things that I believe in. And then finally, around competence, which is really taking personal responsibility for your own development, sharpening your own toolkit, being smart enough ultimately to know what you don't know, and then maybe surrounding yourself ultimately with people who are better at those things than you are. Those are all things that contribute to competence. So I'll finish on this chart with the same speech I made when I introduced it, which is these 4 things happen to be important to me. I've refined them a bit over the course of thinking about them for 20 or 25 years. They've served me well. Doesn't mean that they would serve you well. If there's anything in here that you want to steal, feel free to use it if it's helpful to you. But the more important message is know what you stand for as a leader, be open enough, transparent enough in situations where it's appropriate to do so, to share with peers, with people who work for you, maybe with your boss, with anybody else that you're trying to influence, because it's extremely difficult, in my humble opinion, to separate yourself as a leader and what you believe in and what you stand for from trying to help other leaders get a handle on what they should believe in and what they should stand for. And those 2 things are very much intertwined. And I find quite often in the groups of HR people that I work with that they're either not addressing their own view as a leader, or they're trying to manage those two things very separately and putting most of their energy in developing everybody else but not worrying about themselves. It doesn't work nearly as well as you might like to believe. So let me stop there for a moment, see if there's any questions or comments about what I said on the leadership piece before we shift gears and start talking about the future of HR a little bit.
I don't have any questions yet, but let's give it just a minute in case anyone's typing in the chat box.
Okay, sure.
Okay, looks like Linda has a question. Linda, I've unmuted your line if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
All right, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thanks.
Right, sorry. Yeah, I was just wondering if it's possible to be too good at keeping confidences. I've worked with a client who's been almost ostracized in her own organization because she is known to keep confidences, particularly for people at the top. But then she's accused of being secretive, and encouraging her team to keep confidences is being used against her.
Yeah, that's actually, I'm sorry, I think I interrupted.
Sorry, can you go too far, in other words?
Yeah, I think like anything else in life, I suppose you can take anything to an extreme. When I'm talking about keeping a confidence, it's that difficult situation where some person comes to you with a problem, an issue that they need to talk through, they need to think through, they need to bounce an idea off of somebody, they need some advice as to how to handle it, and they're afraid if they bring it to the wrong person or if it gets out publicly, they're going to look either embarrassed or foolish or worse, become in essence a target for somebody else's retribution. Those are situations where it's a difficult call, because I have found, for example, in my own career, working as an HR leader, where somebody would come to me and say, I need to tell you something in confidence. They tell me what it is. I eventually end up going back to them and saying, if you want this to stay with me, that's okay, but I'm not going to be able to help you resolve it. It's going to be extremely difficult to resolve this particular issue. And I would say, in some circumstances, the individual says, please go ahead. I'd love to have this issue resolved. If you can discreetly help me manage my way through it, that'll be terrific. Probably in fewer cases, but a non-trivial number of cases, people would say, well, I appreciate you giving me that option, but I prefer not to have it discussed with anybody at this time. And you try to respect that where you can. I think where an HR person gets in trouble is if they end up being too secretive about decisions that are being made in the organization, why they're being made, what's the rationale for them being made, and getting the timing right as to when you can disclose those things to people without people feeling like they were lied to. And I don't know if you've had this experience in your careers, but certainly for me, one of my biggest struggles was always knowing that as a management team, we were discussing something that people were not going to like. Examples being a big layoff or headcount reduction, or a big reorganization, or a decision to sell a business, or a decision to acquire a business. I mean, things like that were pretty big, that had big impact on people. And having to sit with that information and not be able to say anything about it until, quote unquote, it was appropriate to do so, and figuring out when it was appropriate to do so is the more difficult thing, because there's no book you can read that will tell you the answer to that. It's about judgment. And I learned a valuable lesson about those types of difficult decisions early in my career, which is no decision is final until it's final. And therefore, no communication about a decision should be made until you know what the decision is and what the impact might be, despite the fact that others who know you eventually may come back and criticize you and say, well, how come you didn't tell me about that sooner? And the answer oftentimes is because the decision wasn't made in its final form until it was made in its final form, and we were then only able to share it more broadly with people. So I don't know if that helps you as you think about, too much confidence, but that would be one way of thinking about it from my perspective. Carrie, any other questions?
Yeah, we have a question from Andy. How do you help someone develop more courage? Is it learnable?
Yeah, that's a great question, Andy. I think courage, like leadership, is learnable. I mean, obviously, there are certain innate attributes that certain people have that make them more courageous or more willing to take risks. That may be a more natural part of their personality, but I absolutely think that the things that it takes to demonstrate courage are learnable. So what would be a few examples of that? As an HR leader, being able to go into a manager, for example, that you're supporting, sitting down with them in a private setting, and giving them some feedback on something that the organization is talking about, probably talking about behind their back. Other people might not be, quote unquote, courageous enough to say it to their face, but recognizing that that leader is going to benefit greatly, even if they might not be immediately appreciative of you, is going to benefit greatly by knowing what that issue is or knowing what the perception is about them or some decision that they've made, and being able to do it on a fact-based, non-emotional basis. Helping them understand, this is what's going on, this is what people are thinking, they may be wrong, they may be right, but this is the perception, I wanted you to know about it. That's kind of a practiced art. And I've seen people as HR leaders grow and mature and get more comfortable over the course of their career in telling people things they don't want, in telling people things that those people don't necessarily want to hear, but would benefit from knowing. The other example that I'll offer where I've seen courage be learned and kind of an acquired taste over time is understanding the difference between collaboration and being a pushover. Because I think sometimes when you talk about people trying to be more collaborative, working together effectively as a team, that sort of thing, there's a natural tendency to assume that, everybody's going to get along, sing kumbaya, hold hands and squeeze lemons, and one of the things I've discovered is kind of ironic, maybe a little bit counterintuitive, but it's absolutely true, at least in my experience, is that one of the most fundamental conditions for effective collaboration is the ability to raise disagreements, acknowledge their
All right, looks like we lost Ian. Okay, if you can hear me, it looks like we lost audio for Ian. I'm going to try to get him back real quick, so just hang tight.
It looks like we have had some technical difficulties. If you give it a minute, we will have Ian rejoin the line and we'll keep it moving forward. So sorry about the issue. Thanks for your patience.
Hello, this is Ian. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Now.
Now, yes, of course. Sounds like the line went dead. I don't know if it was on my end or your end, but
It happened twice.
Okay? Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay. I'm not exactly sure where I was disconnected, so if you can help me, I may be able to go back and repeat myself a little bit. Otherwise, we'll just keep moving forward.
I think we were probably good on that question that you were speaking about. Do you want me to just give you the last question that we have?
Yeah, well, if there's one remaining, if there's a remaining one, let's address that first before we keep going.
Okay, so that is, what would you recommend that a middle manager or director do if they have the courage to push back and aim for doing the right thing, but their boss encourages the subordinate to muzzle it?
Yeah, that's thank you for that question. Obviously, difficult circumstance when you've got a disagreement with your boss about how to push forward on an issue that needs to be addressed when they may not be supportive of doing that. I'll just offer a fairly simple solution to what is a pretty complicated problem without knowing the personalities involved, and that is simply, in my experience, I've seen it work when you can get the boss comfortable with how we can go about fixing the problem or addressing the issue or raising the issue and making sure that they don't end up looking like a fool in the process. So if you can talk them through the steps that are required to raise the issue or have the problem dealt with and get them comfortable that they will not end up looking foolish. It sounds a little ridiculous because it's so selfish, but frankly, that's exactly what we're talking about here. You have a 50-50 chance of persuading them to give you the support you need. If you're not able to do that for whatever reasons, as unfortunate as it can sometimes be, it is extremely difficult to go around your boss, unless it's an issue of a legal or ethical conduct nature where I'd say as an HR person you'd be obligated to go around your boss. But if it's something that's just a matter of difference of opinion or difference of courage, if you're not able to persuade them that they're not going to end up looking foolish or hurt in the process, chances are you will have to muzzle it, which is probably not what you wanted to hear. But my experience tells me that 80% of the time, if you're willing to put the energy into trying to persuade your boss, they'll move a little bit, and 20% of the time they'll be adamant, and you'll just have to suck it up, as they say, and live to fight another day. All right, so I'll tell you what we'll do. Apologize for that temporary glitch in the phone communication. I'm not quite sure what happened. What I want to do is take the remaining time that we have just to quickly go through a few themes to highlight around the future of HR. This is something that if you end up being interested in this HR Emerging Executive Program that we were talking about a little while ago, we will spend quite a bit more time diving through these issues in more depth during that program. But a little bit of history and context. So about a few years ago, John Boudreau, who's also with the center, and I started doing some research in the area of the future of HR. The question we were trying to get to at the time fundamentally was get a better understanding of the changing nature of work, workplace, and what implications does that have for the work that HR people need to do more effectively. To make a long story short, after lots of discussion with lots of people, a lot of data gathering, essentially 6 themes popped out of that initial research, which are summarized in the Future of HR chart. I'm going to just talk briefly about each one for a minute or so. One of the big themes that we started to see was the shift from what we call hero leadership to collective leadership, which is really more of a recognition that leadership is a broad organizational capability that's in some ways independent of specific people, rather than a very person-dependent, person-specific, individually oriented capability where organizations tend to over-rely on a larger-than-life, charismatic leader where, if things go well, that's a strategy that works pretty well. If you happen to be Apple, for example, and I'll just use them as an example, recognizing what an iconic leader Steve Jobs was in many ways, untimely passing, company now trying to establish and reestablish itself as, highly innovative, great product, strong product pipeline. Obviously, a lot of great things happening at Apple, and they're not a company that I do direct work with, so I don't have any personal insight to this. But if you believe a lot of the literature, one of the things that you find people talk about is that even today, products that are coming out of Apple are in many ways tied back to the new product pipeline that was established under Steve Jobs. So if you're Tim Cook, you're trying to establish yourself as a leader, but what about the rest of the Apple leadership, and what kind of brand does that company have? Just one small example of the need to focus on collective leadership rather than being overly reliant on one specific leader. Another trend that's been a big piece of our work is around intellectual property to agile co-creativity, which basically means that in the past, innovation and large-scale change in organizations was oftentimes the job of somebody specific. You might say, well, it's the R&D department in a pharmaceutical company, or it's the creatives who work for an advertising agency. Agile co-creativity is the recognition that creativity and innovation are happening in every job at every level, and even outside of one's own company, reaching outside the boundaries, if you will, of large, complex companies to drive innovation and change. The employment value proposition to personal value proposition theme is really about companies shifting from wanting to be collectively appealing and attractive as a place to work for all employees, which is important, to also recognizing that given shortages in certain types of skills, given the shift in the workforce to people being less willing and interested to work long-term for any one company, there's more of a personal value proposition which is starting to accrue, which is, what's in it for me, the person, and the company being willing to begin to customize and personalize the value proposition of what it means to work for a particular company down to almost the individual level, which is an interesting shift and theme which ties very closely to the next one that we call sameness to segmentation. Short story around this is, think of it this way, most HR people, if you're anything like me, have been brought up believing that one of our most important roles to play is to preserve fairness in the organization. Well, and that's absolutely true. However, fairness taken to an extreme can start to look like sameness, where it's a lot easier to explain to somebody that they're being treated fairly because they're being treated the same as everybody else. Increasingly, what's happening is more around segmentation, looking at pivotal roles, pivotal people inside companies, and being comfortable with biasing certain resources, development experiences, compensation, whatever it may be, toward a more select group of individuals, in no way intended to be disrespectful to the masses, but simply to recognize that resources are limited, time is limited, and there's a certain body of people who may be contributing more to the strategic direction of the company than everybody else. This is probably the theme that makes most HR people the most uncomfortable. The fifth theme that we started looking at was what we ended up calling fatigue to sustainability, which basically had two meanings. One is that most people in the last 5 years or so would say that a lot of people inside their organizations are simply exhausted, being asked to do more with less, being asked to do it faster. And people who are completely burned out don't tend to make for, highly sustainable organizations long term. The second meaning of this was around environmental sustainability, which, quite frankly, when we started talking to people about this a few years ago, HR people didn't even see environmental sustainability as on their radar screen as something that they should be part of. Yet when we talk to people who are actively involved in the environmental sustainability movement in their respective companies, one of their biggest criticisms was that HR was nowhere to be found, and they wanted more partnership and more help because they saw it as an employment branding issue in terms of new employees who might come work there, wanting to know whether or not sustainability, carbon footprint, and the like was even important to the company. And they also saw it as an issue of culture, and is this something that we want our company to be known for? And then the final point, which I won't spend too much time on because we talked about it a little bit earlier, was persuasion to education. This is the shift in persuading people to your point of view through passion and credible relationships, which is kind of the history of HR, if you will, to a degree, shifting more toward education. On a proposal through analytics and data. Now, if you fast forward a little bit from this initial set of themes, over the course of the last few years, John and I have dived a little bit deeper into some additional themes, which are on the next chart, and there's 9 of them here. I'm not going to cover in any way, shape, or form all 9. I wanted to simply make you aware of the fact that as part of this research that we've been doing, one of the things that's come up that's been really fascinating is the fact that many of these themes tend to suggest a level of expertise or experience in topics that most HR people have not traditionally been steeped in. So when you think about things like big data or gamification or mass customization, which is really a marketing principle, the advent of personal technology, trying to get more comfortable with social media, and some of the other things that you'd find on this chart, would not be unusual to realize that most HR people didn't grow up, learning about these things as, central to their their universe, yet all of these themes have a way of impacting what the role of HR is going to be going forward. And so the next chart that talks about role of HR, I wanted to share with you some data that came out of this realization. What we recognized was, we did about 300 people's worth of survey data of HR leaders from across a variety of different companies. And what you can see on this chart that was fascinating to me was we were asking people on each of these 9 themes, what they thought their current level of capability or knowledge was in each of these areas versus what they felt like they needed to have going forward in order to be more effective, given the recognition of the emergence of some of these themes. And what you can see when you look across these bar charts is pretty universally, certain things are more important than others, but pretty universally, there's a big gap between a lot of HR people's knowledge and experience and comfort with each one of these theme areas versus what they think they need to know going forward. And I would like to leave you with a thought to ponder, and that is, even if you realize that you need to be great at all of these things, it would be virtually impossible to become an expert on all of them fast enough to be viewed as relevant for many of the issues that companies are dealing with around all of these different trends and themes. So it tends to suggest, as the final chart will say, HR's role increasingly is becoming one of orchestra conductor. If you think about an orchestra conductor, they don't know how to play all the instruments. Their job is to bring all of those expert instrument players together to make beautiful, effective music. And I think there's an implication here for HR people as you look at many of these future themes and trends, which is that you can't be an expert in all of the things that we'd have to be an expert in order to drive effective change and organizational capability. So what we have to become really good at is reaching outside beyond the boundaries of HR to bring in capability and expertise, be it from marketing, be it from statistics, be it from finance, be it from program management, be it from anthropology, you name it, things that are not necessarily the traditional sub-functions of HR in order to help solve large, complex problems that by their very nature are multidimensional and multidisciplinary. That is where HR's headed. And I know that we're just about out of time, so I want to leave you with the thought of what is it that we're going to do as a profession to reach out more effectively and create much more permeable boundaries between HR as a discipline and other disciplines that are required for us to make an impact as some of these themes really start to take hold. I'll see if there are any, one final question, because I know we're running a couple of minutes late. If anybody has a question or two, I'd be happy to answer it. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and wrap the call up. So let me turn it back to Carrie and see if we have any folks waiting to ask something.
Yeah, Ian, we had a question that I missed from earlier from John. It's regarding HR being an art, and the question is, isn't this taking us back into the relationship-oriented versus data-oriented phenomena you talked about earlier, which is not, in his opinion, a bad thing?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that's a very valid point, and the way I would tend to describe it, it kind of goes something like this. Just because something is an art doesn't mean there's not a discipline behind it. And so in my case, the way I tend to think about this is we've over-relied historically on relationships and persuasion. We've under-relied on data and analytics, and that's an underdeveloped muscle, if you will, that we need to get stronger at and better at. And the objective is balance. And I think that if you think about, to use the term art, whether it's the art of the question or the art of anything else, it's making sure that you have a good balance between the intuition, the relationships, the judgment, the savvy, which are hard to measure but are extremely important to be an effective HR leader, and a little bit of that we're trying to make or change that we're trying to drive. If we can get the balance right, that's what we're talking about.
We lost you for just a few seconds there. If you could reiterate the last part of that.
I was just saying that the balance here is the thing that's the most important, the balance between the judgment and savvy and the relationships and credibility that HR has historically relied on with the analytics and the data, the fact-based storytelling that would make it more likely in the future that people with limited resources are willing to support our point of view. Getting that balance right is what it's really all about.
Great. The only other question we have is from Carol, who asked you to redefine sustainability. I'm wondering if that was when we lost you earlier.
Could be, but if not, let me try it again anyway. So sustainability had two dimensions to it. One is sustainability as it relates to fatigued people. Fatigued organizations do not perform well on a sustainable basis over time. And if you look at what's happened over the last 5 years, given the recession and other competing resource constraints, people are just plain exhausted. The second issue was around environmental sustainability, carbon footprint, environmentally friendly practices that organizations are beginning to pay more and more attention to. Historically, HR people have not seen themselves as having a role to play in the environmental sustainability movement, yet it turns out to be one of the most important things that particularly new entrants to the workforce pay attention to. A lot of college students, for example, when they're looking at working for your company, want to know what your position is on environmental sustainability. And it's a culture issue. You know, to what degree is this aspect of environmental sustainability going to be a recognizable, important part of what our company stands for and how we're known as a brand? And HR, up until very recently, has been viewed by non-HR people who've been involved in these works to be largely absent. And that's a trend that we're starting to see change, but it's been a slow change.
Thanks. That was our last question. Sorry, Ian and everyone, about the technical difficulties, but thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Ian, for a great webinar.
Thanks, all. Talk to you soon now. Bye-bye.